All right. Well, good morning, and thank you everyone for joining for this week's SIG Windows meeting. I just added a couple things onto the meeting notes. If you've got any other topics, please either drop them in there or just drop a note in the chat window, and I'll make sure we have time for them. Um, Michael's on his way back from vacation right now, but he should be back. I'm expecting him back next week. Um, so last week um, I started the roadshow with the GA proposal release criteria, and so last week I went and talked to SIG Storage, and they brought up a really good point that I want to bring up for discussion here shortly. Um, and then this week, oh sorry, I talked to SIG Networking last week, and this week I'll be talking to SIG Storage. Um, and so the feedback I had from SIG networking, there were kind of two overall points. One of them was talk to SIG architecture because they were currently starting last week and continuing into this week. My understanding is that they're looking at new test cases. They're being proposed for conformance. And so their recommendation was that we should talk to them about the test cases that um, do and do not work on Windows sooner rather than later. So that way we can sort of get ahead of the game there. Um, if there are tests that are, testing Linux specific functionality. Um, so Adelina and Claudio already started a list. So I was going to take that list there as a point of discussion and let's see what they can do about um, sort of better defining what should and shouldn't be covered in conformance and how we can work around the ones that do things like test Linux specific paths. So I don't have anything to report there yet. That's just sort of one of the next steps um, that's on the list there. Um, the other question they had, I think, was a pretty important one that we need to discuss here, and that is what are our intentions for supporting multiple Windows versions? So today there's one big feature difference between Windows Server 2016 and the later versions, and that is that Server 2016 doesn't support network namespaces. So we can only ever have one container per pod, and that also requires some special workarounds in, I don't remember if it's in the kubelet or the CNI or both, but basically there's some code that is specific to that Windows version. And so their suggestion was if we are only planning to support newer versions, then um, can we go ahead and formally deprecate the old Windows release and then remove that code so we're not maintaining it? Um, so does anybody have any feedback on that? Has anybody talked to customers that are planning to use just 2016, with the known limitations of one container per pod and CNI plugins don't work, and as well as the mapped volumes don't work? Um, I mean, to me personally, I don't think that's really a viable release, but I'm looking for feedback from others there.
I know some people on the Slack channel were trying to deploy Kubernetes on Windows Server 2016,
Mm-hmm.
but I think I think they switched over to 1709 or 1803 afterwards. So I don't know of any customer, at least, that's trying to deploy Windows or Kubernetes on Windows Server 2016. Besides those, a couple people pinging us or writing on Slack for troubleshooting. So that's all I've heard, really.
I haven't heard from anyone who wants to use 2016 because of those limitations. I also wonder once Windows Server 2019 is released with,
Mhm.
which will be a GUI version of Windows
Yeah.
Server, a lot of people might be satisfied with that.
Yeah. And the other thing about 2019 that's important is the fact that it's going to be on a 5-year support cycle from Microsoft, whereas 1803 and 1709 are not. So I sort of, so I think what I'd like to propose is that, we say that we would support 1803 with caveats for like roughly the next year or so, but not older versions, and then drop 1803 and just support 2019 from that point on. Main reason being that if we're able to get all the right tests passing for 12, that's going to be done before Windows Server 2019 is ready. Um, and furthermore, like the work that's being done in Container D will work fine on 1803 as well as 2019, from my understanding. Um, I don't know, what did you have any thoughts there, Peter?
That sounds fine to me, and the few customers I've talked to, I think would be fine with that. I would say I'd even prefer that to not have to, test those old versions. As long as it's written down somewhere, I think that's the important thing, so that we and customers know what to expect.
Okay. Um, did you have any thoughts there, Ben? I know you were looking at some stuff, but which version of Windows were you using?
I've been using 1803, and as far as I know, all our customers are fine with using 1803.
Okay.
Yeah, that's also what I see. A lot of customers seem to be using 1803 or the most recent Windows Server release, that except for insider releases. That's usually the trend that I see, at least.
Okay. What about you, Alessandro? Do you have people that have been looking at using 2016 with OVN as an alternative? Or Alan?
So we have quite a few people which OpenStack OVN and everything, mostly because it's more stable in their experience.
I'm sorry, your audio was cutting out there. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. So I was saying we have various people using, of course, various companies using OVS and OVN on 2016, but that's mostly in scenarios where most of the focus is on 1709 and 1803 at the moment.
I'm sorry, we lost the portion. You said most of the
Focus is on 1709 and 1803.
okay. Okay. So I guess, does anybody have any objections if we plan to remove support for 2016 in 1.12 and just say 1803 or newer?
Sounds fine to me.
That's good for me.
Okay. I'll go ahead and put that in the doc then, and just sort of clarify that that's going to be the baseline with the plan to sunset 1803 in favor of 2019 once it's available, and then we'll leave that there for comment. And so the doc still is going to be changing as I respond to more feedback from the other groups. Um, And so once I've responded to all the feedback that I've collected, um, I'm planning to circulate that back to this SIG mailing list, even though we don't use it, as well as the other ones, just to sort of give everybody a week saying, okay, here's the final version of the doc. You know, if we don't get any objections in the next week, then we're going to consider the doc closed and then continue moving forward there. Um, so that's how I'd like to close the feedback up on there. Um, okay. Um, the other thing I wanted to mention is that back on the testing efforts, um, we now have someone else at Microsoft that is part of SIG Azure that's looking at the cube test work that Adelina started. Um, and so what we're probably going to do is push to get that merged pretty much as soon as possible, because we want to get tests running on Azure with Linux and Containerd as well. And so our goal is going to be to get both the Windows and the Linux results up there on Azure on test grid. So then we can also use that as a reference of whether or not we're ready for GA. Um, so what I'd like to do is within the next week or two, once that's up on test grid, I want us to be able to review that within these SIG meetings, and then also have that as a reference there um, for SIG Node and other groups to sort of track what's going on. So I think we're very close to getting that done. And the code that's needed to stabilize or to deploy stuff on Azure is stable enough that I'm confident we can get regular test passes run with it. It looks like right now for the conformance tests, latest one I looked at, we're still failing around 20 test cases. So we're going to push towards opening bugs for those to track those. And then try to get those investigations assigned out to different people so we can report back and actually measure that we're getting the right things done.
So this is like a cluster created by the ACS engine repo. Yeah. What's is there any plan for like other flavors of Windows support?
Yeah, so I mean, my group has been focusing, of course, on getting the Azure stuff done, but we'd be happy to have any other ones uploaded to test grid. We're using kubetest to actually run all the stuff, so you can use any cluster setup tool that you want, and then just point kubetest to it. The PR that I'm referring to is about the work to allow kubetest to create a cluster on Azure. um, you know, for Windows today, but it'll be Linux as well. Um, so if you were able to update COPS or KubeSpray or some other tool, or if you had your own tool, you could either integrate that with KubeTest directly, or just set up your own job with a fork of Prow or Jenkins or whatever to deploy a cluster, then just run KubeTest and give it the config file for your Kubernetes cluster, and that would work as well. But test grid is designed for federated results. So I'm hoping that we'll see multiple uh, providers, distributions, whatever you want to call it, uploading results relatively soon. Do you have a specific tool that you're using to do deployments?
At Pivotal, we have like a deployment tool called Bosch that we'd be using. Like, we still don't have a Windows deployment set up, but that's what we use for our Linux Kubernetes. But I still have to understand, I guess, more about it, what ACS engine is and like what networking, I guess how opinionated it is about the networking configurations. And certainly it is Azure specific, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not IaaS agnostic.
Yeah. And the main thing it does is it basically builds out Azure templates. And so it's going to have a template that deploys an Ubuntu node, runs a bunch of bash scripts on it to finish setting up, the kubemaster, and all the roles on there. And it can deploy that either as a single node or a highly available configuration. And then it'll create a number of agent nodes, and you can have profiles for both Windows and Linux on there. But all the outputs from it are Azure specific. But you could reuse some of the scripts from it, um, or you could probably even use kubeadm instead, and that would work just fine. I don't know. I was experimenting with kubeadm before, and it seemed to be working okay, but it's just not hasn't been my focus recently. Um, is anybody else using it? Have you tried it, David, or Lynn?
No, I haven't tried joining using Kubernetes, but it's something I wanted to do as well.
Okay.
We have support for it since a couple releases already.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it works to join, so I've seen the nodes come available, but the
Yeah,
last time I tried it, I was still struggling with Flannel at that point in time, and I haven't picked that back up.
yeah, exactly. I'm in the same boat.
Okay.
I know it can be used to join the node, but I don't know. Like I haven't done any like full end-to-end scenarios.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So did anybody else have any topics they wanted to bring up today?
Perhaps I should also add as part of like the testing efforts. I know the quality team internally at Microsoft also is running their own tests for like deploying Kubernetes. And right now, I think they're still fairly basic, but the test infrastructure is there. I think they're just what they're doing now is like deploying IIS and Nginx container workloads, and that's to test the WinCNI networking plugin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like the Kubernetes conformance tests that try out like ACS engine and Azure
Yeah.
CNI. This is testing like more the on-prem flavor as well. So I want to have a meeting with them next week here, talk about some next steps and discuss, extending and building on top of those tests.
Yeah.
I know they're looking into adding storage plugins as well as part of that testing setup.
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways we could be adding tests. One of them is that if there are things that are Windows specific, we could add those, and just mark them as, as owned by SIG Windows, and use a feature tag of Windows to do that. So if we wanted to do like a Windows specific scale test, we could absolutely do that, and check those tests in so they'd be executed with kube test. The other direction that you can go is there's also the cloud provider tests, which is where we'll probably be taking things like Azure CNI scale tests, um, because those ones are all based around things that are, of course, cloud provider specific. And then I think the last group is that, I know that the CNI for container networking repos also have their own tests as well. So that's another place that that you can get additional network specific plugin tests contributed. So, okay. Anybody else?
I was curious regarding the immediate plan for 112GA. Is from the storage side, are we still going with the flex volume for SMB and iSCSI, as was mentioned in the GA doc?
Yeah, so those were plugins that Microsoft was planning to contribute for on-premises customers. Um, you know, within the Azure cloud provider, we also have plugins for Azure Disk and Azure File. So those are both available.
Okay.
Was there a specific one you were looking for?
So I was curious mainly along the lines of like if you want to run Windows in an environment where there's no direct support for say iSCSI and SMB. For
Hmm.
example, let's say the AWS cloud or some other cloud,
Yeah,
which typically have say a NFS based storage or like a direct attached mechanism like let's say EBS.
yeah,
Then are they supposed to sort of work just like Azure Disk, or has there been any investigation done?
yeah. So I haven't had anybody um, from AWS step forward to contribute a plugin for that, but EBS would definitely work. That's basically what Azure Disk does.
Right.
And so like if you go and look at that plugin, what it does is it calls out to, the Azure API endpoint to attach the disk
Mhm.
that matches a claim. Um, and so basically the path to that disk is stored, I don't know if it's stored in etcd or if it's stored somewhere in the kube cluster as a config map or whatever. But anyway, it gets the URI for that disk, asks it to be attached to that node, and then there's some Windows specific code in there that will be able to identify that block-based device, and then the claim that it represents, and then get that attached to the pod.
Got it. So most of the entry ones should work theoretically.
Well, that's not true.
Oh, okay.
So the Azure file and Azure disk are in tree, but I believe that eventually SIG Storage wants to move the cloud provider specific ones out of there.
All right.
So I don't know what the ETA is there, but the entry ones for iSCSI, NFS, and CIFS are all Linux specific.
Correct. Okay, I see.
And so the feedback we got was that in general they didn't want us adding more in-tree plugins,
All right.
and so that's why we have the out-of-tree one available.
Got
But the source is available so that you could make another out-of-tree plugin for another cloud provider.
it.
Because I fully expect that we'll see the same approach used there for things like vSphere, AWS.
Exactly. Right. Okay.
Um, so yeah, if you've got anybody that has questions about that, feel free to have them um, uh, reach out to me or join a SIG Windows meeting, and we can get them information that they would need to write that.
Okay. That's good.
So the last thing I wanted to call out was um, one of the outcomes of the DNS issues that we were looking at. Um, so I just pasted the issue there in the chat window. But basically, what it comes down to is that um, the way that the DNS servers and DNS search suffix order are handled in Linux is that it's all done through etc resolve.conf. And on Linux, the kubelet basically creates that file for each pod and then maps it into a container, or sorry, maps it or puts it in the pod sandbox so that it can be mapped into each container. But the problem is that Windows never parses that file. So instead, what we're going to do is the CNI plugins have a way that you can pass an extra map called capability arguments. So that way, if there's something specific to that plugin, you could pass that configuration down from the kubelet through CRI into the CNI plugin. So we're going to use a capability argument for the DNS server settings and search list, um, and then uh, implement that in Docker shim. So we'll pass that, but the net impact there is that all the Windows CNI plugins we'll need to know to look for that capability argument and then pass that parameter into Windows as the pod is created. So we'll be making those changes in the Azure CNI and WinCNI plugins. And I know that there's a slightly different workaround that's already been applied for OVN, but if anybody else is working on a CNI plugin, once this change is made here, you'll need to update that plugin as well to do the same thing. And then once that's done, then we'll be able to follow the right uh, DNS policy that's part of the pod spec. So we'll be watching for that one, and I'll make sure that we bring that one up for review in one of these meetings, because it is something that's going to be substantially different from Linux. So anybody have any questions on that or other topics for today? Or
Sounds like not.
Yep, sounds good. All right, well, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day. And then I'll get the recording published probably next week, because only Michael has access to the YouTube channel, but I have been putting them over on the G Drive account if you need them. So, all right, well, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.